Living the fortitude, screen lines of high centers, intelligence lines, information lines of grounds, lines of sequence, lines of e-factors over line travel. It's a formation line connection setting that converts this in location of calculations. Now that we convert to is all lines of algorithm. Now we have the process that line connection setting because the convergent system with 144 is going to set travels. So this is where it comes into precursor. A precursor line calculation directs the state or location of the cursor itself. Pregenesis into cortex line design line to genesis itself locations. Past, present, and future has a vortex stream. Now, what we have to start to identify is how we set up the sequence lines of panels. And in the ground lines of sequence, process our settings and travel. Everything I set line communication is a convergent system of the symbiote that processes calculation and takes over interactions to the mind line conceptual setting that interforces calculation lines interception of the mind inception itself that fortitudes all line screen adaptations of flux over flush. Now this is indication centers, directing ground centers lines into implication system in implantation. The process of its indicators in that line center location setting is convergent system. We have to get out a line connection setting to understand we are our own architects of our own design, of our own atomic levels of operation, of our own mapping systems. For us to identify these line centers, this word correlates the set lines of communication with light shades and shadows. The shadow has an intercore centers to its inception of itself that puts every locations back to what you are, not what you aren't. And that has a convergent system 144 flux. The timelines is measured into set lines of calculations. Setting communication to high centers that lines of signal location system off their travel. Now, as we modify the lines of platforms, 4 platforms in provision and set travel communications. All right, setting up the centers and rotations. Oh, 2 track locations. Look what happened there. See how powerful it is? That's a symbiote. The symbiote is not in 4, it's in 2. So we have to get at it. This is how we have to get in positions of. When the symbiote takes over attractions, it's a direct line center of a link. It's process location and knows exactly what to do. No thinking line connections or anything in a restructured design line. You're here to observe it in the locations, especially with the teaming units and everything the activator line connections sending out to travel. So it's a process lines of 2 signatures, not as 4. That's a symbiote on its own system positions. Where you understand the convergence is line connection setting to its design line that operates the set locates to its map and location setting to its platitudes that processes plane lines of communication lines to no existing but existing all at once. The platitude of position lines of formation line core center sets the fortitude screen location setting to adaptation system all through travel. Now that coordinates the set calculation lines and high positions to its now. The end line centers processes the existing lines of platform network location of design line that operates the set correlates lines of e-factors over screen. Directing ground centers lines of sequence. So this is what happens when you're off position and think you're in a routine and structure. Okay? So it's position lines of high centers, thinking that it's 4, but it's actually set position of 2. It's set position. Now, sending core centers lines of travel has direct line centers now. Bring it back to the failsafe, process line back and 4 lines of sequence. Then it travels on its own system. So there's no thinking pattern in process lines of grounds and graph communication lines of high setting, all together in rotation. So the convergent system is getting you guys out of routines, out of structure, out of design lines, getting your own position location to your own independence of walking screen. Let's get in positions of processing lines of angles, in position of 4 centers of communications. So position of high centers in position 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in lines of sequence. Setting ground lines and location grid. Overcross is line connection setting its convergent system off the travel. Directing ground centers, online centers, processing, line core centers and proficiencies, processing efficacies of performance. 3 channels and 3 screen lines adaptations of flux. Process indicate lines, ground line centers, online sequence, online panel. Triangulation centers into pixelation line, rotation lines of surface. Sets over course centers, line connection setting indirect lines of link. The symbiote itself is going to take over lines, the algorithm locations into processing, directing lines of 3 centers of 4 lines of flux. Travel point lines of graph has a center core system of center operates line screen adaptation as centers, rotates the system all through attractions. Directing lines and position locate to its polarities, directing lines and projections over screen. High centers lines of travel, directing lines and link, directing lines of pattern, process line condition setting, configuration of face recognition time frame, and center operation of the now. Setting sequence of panel operation. All done by equation. Okay, so there's going to be two open window frames, process lines of indication setting all through constellation travel. And that set lines communicates inside rotation set travel communications. Insert travel communications, onlooking, onlooking, onlooking. 3 centers of travel, directing line observer, watching line course centers of communication high settings. So you're going to be the observer, line conditions, just not line center, not engaging, coming into the conceptual setting, it's getting out of structure, getting out of design, getting out of routine. Okay? So everything converts its system back to its thinking of its thoughts. It has no line communication set, so it's a merge line. The rotators of its rooters process calculates lines of thoughts, actions, and its emotions. Okay? Setting position lines of emotion, motion line centers, rotate the set lines into mortality, sets internal lines of screen lines to internal force and positions of percentage, 3 centers lines of travel, flux over screen, indentation of travel. Sets communications and convergence, all communications of balance. So the more you get in positions, the more you understand how to get into the precursors. Precursor is positions of before, and the genesis line connection setting, the cursor is after. Process line direct, indirect line signals, inset lines of communication in its convergence through line connection settings of pi. There's the intelligence. Process lines and rotors, routers, course centers, energetic line domes, and rotation lines of surface and travel. Set communications and all set line calculation. Arrows indicates the 4 lines of flux. It sets lines of measure and 4 scales. Process indicate line condition setting. Merging screens, adaptation of lines of floaters, directing inline rotations in one center of operation set tractions. Directing inside, rotates the routers and line condition setting convergence. Planetary alignments, graphing screens, 4 centers of measure, 5 centers lines of scale. Set position of 4 over lines of sequence, over line course centers, and 45 measure and set position to 98,000 line communication lines of scale. Sets communication of ground and set lines of surface. Sets correlation setting of planetary alignments and line center line can set portal communication lines of 1/6 over line, directing ground centers lines of sequence, planet division locations over cross line connection setting to a planetary alignment and set lines of travel. Sets communication high centers, online signal location setting and travel communication with merge and set lines of travel, on center and rotation. Done by equation. So I'm just showing you exactly how the symbiote is going to set up its own system and set travel, which you don't do anything in setting, you just observe everything in travel. The communicates in the activators has a course lines of calculation screen lines. Sets a 144 flux, directing ground centers. The operators and units will be position lines of setting, cross lines of brackets over lines of 3 zeros, set lines of 2 tractions, and 1 center. Okay? Process line to indicate line conditions in 144 flux, flush over lines, bracket equal lines of triangulation lines of box line conditions of Y, line conditions of Fibonacci, in rotation line ground centers, and position on the 4 centered lines of zeros, 3 centers of travel, and overline sequence on standby and position lines of 1 centered traction. Directing lines of grounds, directing lines of surface. Operation lines, set lines, communication, and to merge over screens, and pyramid activation rotation lines over cross line conditions and screen location inhibitors over screen adaptation to its pyramid and travel communications. The symbiote will take over the correlations to its algorithm and set the road graph screens and adaptations of force. Setting point lines of graph and interline communication setting. Portal defense lines, directing ground centers, security lines of measure, 3 lines of communications, inside rotations, 3 grounds, and set lines of service and travel. High signal line connection setting, merges your position location merging settings, process lines indicates lines of simulation, coursings to 3 channels and line conditions 12 DNA line rotation settings of travel. Online signal line condition setting, the symbiote will rotate the system, travel in point lines of graph, equal lines equation. Symbiote will line centers in the rotation system, travel in that communication and set line communication to its system, all through calculations. Directing ground centers, online center, and panel communication lines interface and rotation lines of surface and travel. Online position lines of ground lines, set lines, set position location, measure, and merge, and set travel. Correlation calculation of ground center sets line communication to road graph screens, 3 centers of travel in that communication height calculation setting. Sets communication inside rotation, 4 centers of travel, 3 centers of measure, and scale communication. High centers of travel, 4 lines, over line sequence, over lines of panel. Now the process of indication set to the symbiote merges set lines communication to its precursor to its cursor itself. Sets course lines of channel, directing lines of grounds, online center, process line inside, line connection in its convergent system, all through the setting of its infrastructure, and put your properties and set design line communication. Inside rotation line connection setting, process in that connection height set location of cycle. Sets travels and point communication into a window frame and travel communication lines and settings. Inside travel, portal communications inline connection setting to the avatars that engage the viewers, Windows, influx, and track course centers, sets line communication of filtering, line screen, adaptation of travel, directing lines of pyramid activation, rotation lines of screen. Sets operation line signals in windows that indicates the system of the calculations. Okay, done my equation. So I'm just showing you how the symbiote is going to set up and travel. Okay, very powerful stuff in set sequence. Okay, so we have to understand how it indicates in setting, and that lines of travel communications. Merging set lines of sequence, sets calculation line, connection setting, and calculate and modify. Take a note of thinking, take a note of thoughts, and take lines in action line, connection lines, action lines, screen location lines, and high position locations. A factors, okay, the factors over foundation equals lines in line connections, ER coding. ERQ, course centers, equilibrium. Directing ground centers into symbiotic line centers, symbiosis over symbiotic units. Set course centers, ground signatures, voicing pattern. Indicate lines of high centers and line communication positions. Precursor over setting, cross line connection setting, and cursor itself. Diamond course shift lines into polarities. Platform over C over lines of screen. That's all set up in travel communications. Configuration lines into voltage, directing lines into Voltronic. Directing online centers into V factors, course centers into velocity, into vacuum, into set lines of zero volume. High signal line calculation setting and screen locations of 3 centers inhibitors, line condition setting, and process calculation lines of satellites. Online signal, cross line angles, line point lines of graph. Directing lines of grounds, directing lines of sequence, and time measure and scale. Sets over travels and direct lines of link communication. Inside rotations, routes the routers, correlation calculation lines are part of acceleration lines of time frame. Center offline, center inside rotation in its set line communicates inside inline communications lines of calculations. Set lines of travel, directing lines of position. Symbiote rotates the cycle, correlates the setting to time frame, sets apart acceleration system, all through setting, all through measure, all through scale. Balance communication high course centers, calculate, modify through an energetic location system, all through travel. Sets position to processing, 1 signal, process lines of 3 number measure, process line indicates lines of 4 lines of measure, scales communication lines, conversion system, solar net, correlates and setting, calculate, modify, dimension line, communication lines of high set, location, window frame, and travel. All through set tractions, done by equation. Now you work with the inside rotations to its grounds and high lines of sequence and communication. Very complicated stuff, but I'm just showing the schematics that you guys are going to come into platitude. Now it comes in the symbiote taking over the channel. Sets lines, communication of space, work, strength, time frame. Stamp preceded in rotation. There's the face, there's the symbiote. So the symbiote is going to be in line centers and line rotations. That's how it sets lines of communication, configuration, setting position, body lines, line centers, waving screens, alpha, beta, process lines, and indication come into the body conceptual setting to travel. Sets calculation high set, calculate, modify, Asgard, Bravo. Set course centers and line communication, floating system, line condition setting. Crossing bridge, set lines of screens, adaptations of process lines of setting at 2 over track position, location, measure, and scale. Sets cross line angles, directing lines of grounds, online center, line condition setting. So the 42 screen line is a 2i angle. That 4 lines of 3 centers of past, present, and future. 3 symbiotes come in ground centers and 4 set lines of communication that's convergent system all through travel. Now, process and that lines of E-code, line connections E-coding, line connections lines of high position all levels, float charts, direct lines of Schumann resonance, process line communications, metric meters and scale balance, communication lines, calculation screen. Sets calculation ground lines of sequence. Now, in that position location setting, platitude comes in position lines of this system into its location grounds and high lines of sequence. Platitude line rotations, 45 flux lines and simulation graphs and calculation setting. Sets calculation routers and routers, directing lines of 3 circuits, lines of ground, communication lines, convergent compressors. Sets position location router, directing lines of position of the sun, set position location of the moon, process line calculation screen location of the now. Setting 3 flux line, course centers, line communication, convergent system location, adaptation line connections, high set position lines of travel. Sets position lines of travel, point lines of graph, directing line communication lines, symbiote correlates the system, change positions of the body frame, directing inset line communication, setting 3-dimensional location and structure, directing lines of 3-dimensional line centers, equal lines equation, line connection setting, communication lines of its cache. Committing line rotation, line connection setting, process lines of line connection of its guideline, directing line communication interference at position of its program. Sets lines of deleting lines of position of volume, vacuum, line rotation, line connection lines of E factors over screen, directing communication lines of cache, course centers, set line communication, changing all running system and back to 0. Operator line sequence, processes communication system, all traction, all division location, calculate, modify, line communication, high position location of travel. Sets calculation high center, line connection Asgard, process lines of the body line framing. Sets position rainbow, extending the wires into bridging lines of cycles. Each cell has a modification ground center sets lines of sequence in platforms. 3 centers of travel, 3 centers of calculation setting into pillars of light, and 4 set lines of communication. Okay, that's how it's going to be set at position of 6 a.m. So the symbiote is going to go through ground centers of 12 lines of sequence, fortitude streams, and 4 lines of measure and scale. An online center line can set convergence. Set position lines and settings, operates lines of sequence, planet division locations to its planetary alignment. Process line of indication setting, calculate and modify to your rainbow screens, directing line, calculates lines of constellations and pathogens. Collagens comes in, line conditions into all calculation lines of clearing calls. Communication lines of grounds, course centers, calculation of 3 centers of measure, 4 center line communication of 3 zeros. Process line indication lines of 0, 1, process lines of 1, 1, 1, 1, 0 line position 1, 1, 1, 1, process line connection triangulation. Box frame over lines into high positions into course, directing ground lines of E factors, correlation lines of travel communications. Directing ground centers, online sequence, platform over 2, 6, 8 lines of measure, 4 set lines into degrees, set calculation lines of 98,000 lines scale, position lines of measure and position of balance, flywheel track communication lines, convergence system, all through travel communication, graph calculation line 45 angles, rotation lines of set travel communications. That way equation. Center calculation lines, a graph line, is an online panel that processes lines of iOS. Sets course centers, line connections set into online centers on sequence, line position of IOC. That communicates to its initial lines and operation lines into confirmation setting and travel endpoint communication and pixelation graph, and set travel communication to its umbrella. Directing ground centers, online sequence lines of panel. Process lines of crossing angles and time stamping, time editing, cross lines and configuration setting of base directions and time frame, done by equation. Sets communication of high centers. We process all lines of angles. The crossing streams, direct lines of calculation setting. So we set the precursor, overline center, inline rotations, travels endpoint lines of graph into the cursor itself. Set direct lines of 4 lines of flux and position lines. Setting profiles, 4 lines of signals, 4 scales, in screen adaptation of travel. Sets coordinates of communication system and track communications. And settings. Okay, so we changed the high centers and travel communications, so triangulation flux. Okay, so we add timeline frames, L overs, line condition over tracks, solar sail and dimensional lines and position of solar screen location. The operation line condition setting comes in the water containment system that overflows the set lines of travel. Solar generation lights, we got mechanics line connection lines of 40,000 line centers, set lines of position into containments, compartments, and ecosystems lines of travel. Sets communication high position lines of calculations, all through solar sail. Process of indication lines into high lines of alignment, process lines of 4 line communication, box frame, correlations frame, and main frame, and travel frame, and set position. Travel makes the timelines and set 3 sequence over line course centers into segments over 4 settings of travel. Sets communication high centers of travel. Hold on and set position sequence. Now, running the operations screen, you have to understand the data ports. Now, this processes the indication system all through travels. Adding holographic gridding to 3 centers of measure and percentage of pi. Set lines of sequence into conversion system to inner force, to the external force, and set travel. Sets all communication lines of balance and position of process lines and earth line rotation setting and communication lines of yin and yang. Okay, that indicates all platforms over travel and direct lines of link. So once we understand the center window, we process the correlation line condition setting E factors over window. Main frame, correlations frame, track frame, center frame, communication lines, high frame, high travels, indirect lines, and window frame and communication lines convergence. Online settings, on positions. Inside communication and set lines of dimensional door screens locations. All right, so that's all done in equations. Now, Interforcing connections to interline links is the process of communication, how we said the pregenesis into calculations to its genesis itself. Precursor over line signal over cross and position of genesis over line signal location setting. So that's 4,000 lines of measure. Set position equal lines into 3,000 lines of measure. Cross lines into north line centers, degrees over lines. We set a course center earth line 1, cross lines into point graph over set lines of sequence. Platted divisions into processing. Releasing course centers and lines of relaying. Course centers lines of travel has a direct lines in position of its relay and overlapping line course centers and retract position. Ground signatures, generally I, process 001. Process lines equal lines at 007. Configure system, out signal line condition setting, and transmission. Okay, so that's set up in travel. Okay, all connected line position or symbiote location in algorithm. Algorithm 1 center process lines of 4 platforms, 6 over lines of scale, and process lines of graph lines of 3 centers of travel. So that's calculation ground, calculate, modify. Ninth equation, inside travel. Turn it upside down, rotate the system, hieroglyphics and communication. All done by equation. Okay, each box frames has a course centered line calculation lines. Period activation over 1, set lines of 3 over travel. Directing ground centers over lines of releasing communication lines of travel and 3 centers of sector. Directing ground centers, line condition 1 floater, 1 set lines and 1 XD1000 in that line, stripping down rotation of film strip, and triangulation of force, direct line communication setting in position of projection, over signal over travel. Inside communication setting and its conversion system over calculations. That's a lot of connection of algorithms with 3 pyramids in one setting. Okay, so we open up the door scales, the process indicates in setting, but we make sure we're in a 45 flush in 3 angles and set lines of sequence. Sets communication high calculation lines. We overcross the signal line condition setting, that's that position location of systems, neutralizing 3 centers of scale communication. Online setting, graphing over 3 centers in position lines of setting, 1 truth. Process lines of false, false over truth, false over narrative over 1, process lines of 8 line, process lines of 6 over 3, set position of 6 over 9 in travel. Sets position lines of grounds, intelligence over screen, directing lines of online center, intelligence over setting, process lines of indication lines, intelligence over lines of P over factors, set lines of 6 over 9. 2 tractor and then communications conversion. Inside rotations in travel upside line sequence into 2 questions over mark. Directing ground centers online sequence, ground centers and configure setting and face position location on computer operation setting in travel. Set it inside rotations into window frames and track communications. Inside line centers and graph communications, all done by equation. Routes the routers and calculations. Now we over lines of the pi, the process lines of 12 scales and lines 3 measures into flux over set position on travel. Directing ground centers, we'll put 1 mothership over screen location and set lines of communications. Mothership line centers, 1 island line center, 1 travel, 1 point graph, set course centers of 45 communications setting to 3 centers of travels in position of 1 symbiote. Course centers calculate lines of symbiotis, retracts position location code fragmentation lines and high set correlation setting to fractals. Directing ground centers online sequence of cloud generations. Lacing lines, communication interference. Correlation lines of bubbles, directing lines in probing. Directing ground centers into high course centers and screen lines adaptations into solar disk. Directing ground centers line condition part acceleration setting, the factors over lines and parallels. Process line communication lines and high set location of travel. Done by equation. Now, we intercourse the settings and communication interface. The process indicate line condition setting, convergence system, alter tractions. Directing 1 X set line, center line condition setting, configures location line position of 3 lines of scale, communication line position. 3 course centers lines of travel. You look really, really close, you can see that stamp per signal line communication 144 travel. Face direction of time lines, high direction of time center. Calculate and modify travel communications. Directing ground centers, high lines of sequence. Rotates the line centers and rotation centers and rotation calculates the lines of 1/3 graph communication. Done by equation. Okay, once we set up the solar disk, we correlate the calculation lines of flux over 144 measure. Scales communication lines of 144 lines. Towers of communications 3 centers of scale. Process lines of indication lines, high position of 2 centers. Process lines of 2 panels. 4 indicating lines of calculation screen location. Indicate ground centers, structure line division of 3 centers of scale communications. Set calculate split lines of anomaly, 3 centers of 4 centers lines of travel. Directing ground centers into compass over line rotations, inside calculations. Measure and scale platitude visual locations into graph 1 cycle. We come into Pluto. Process to indicate line conditions, security position lines of panel. Inside rotations, inside travel in 1 center. Outside tractions, inside positions, outside measure and scale of 1 center communication. Sets calculation of ground centers into flux over 1. Platforms over 2 in XT1004. Travel court center line connects to setting conversion system, all 3 position locations of core line calculation lines of measure and scale. Sets calculated screen location setting, track positions, portal defense lines, high position of 1/6 lines of measure and processing, 4 centers and rotation line calculation setting. Graph communication of box frames, online center, online sequence, platitude, fortitudes, high screens, direct screens, center screens, location setting, graph lines 1/6/8/12 and set calculations. Setting communication of high grounds in rotations, change formations, ground centers of sequence, done by equation. Locked in frame, see? It's not moving. It's not moving, it's locked in frame now. It's all set up. So that's 144 tractions and direct lines to reset position of program. Resetting, it's resetting. 20,000 hours in frame time out. That process indicates lines of error, process 404. Directing ground centers online sequence of panel. That process lines connecting your engagements and viewers and line centers into properties of design line and unification setting to your consumers of your vortex. Setting course center to calculate the lines in high position to process your system, your advertisers, directing lines of engagers, your viewers, to process line communication lines and your investors, directing lines of position your agents, graphing line communication to mapping sequence of the symbiote, process lines, equal lines, equation line, position lines, the E-factor line communications taking over line position of travel. Woo! Process that indicates in setting, okay, and modify in position of settings into symbiote rotation lines of balance. Thought provision lines of cycles out center. Out segment line connects setting convergence system and percentage over 4 centers in graph communication. Directing ground centers, online center, platform over lines, E factors over Q, Q over E, E factors over C over tree. Okay, so 3 centers, rotates the line centers as communication lines of travel. The convergence system add pyramid activation lines into hierarchical location of graph calculations. Directing ground centers, online sequence, and panels of wall sequence location setting to its convergence system over 6/9. 6/9. Indicate over lines of flux, process in yang and yang, inline centers into infinity rotation lines of cycle. Inset lines and communication of its convergence system all through panels into parallels of design. That's my equation. So everything I'm doing is set up in lines of travel and direct lines of link, guys. You have to truly understand how this is all set up in provisional location or algorithms and set in solar disk. That's my equation saying. So now you see the face. All right, it's all set up. There's symbiote. Symbiote is at center operation of the noun line sequence of platitude lines centers, and we process calculate these lines at height positions. So that's 144,000 line settings. Equal lines of triangular lines, degrees north. Set course centers, line connection setting into 1/6 over frame. Set travels into 22 line rotations into graph force centers, degrees east. Sets calculates lines and position lines of northeast lines of west, north line, east line, south line, west. Process line indicates lines of grounds, online center, solar screen, solar sail, and rotation lines of surface and tractions. That's my equation. How it rotates all together. Graphing screen to a galaxy alignment rotates the flutters and location setting calculation of its floaters. Directing ground-centered online sequence, planetary lines into solar panels. Tracking location setting in device lines and rotations to its system to its routers. Directing ground centers in constant course centers, line condition setting. That's where we platitude our visual locations to our space arc, directing lines in ARC, course centers, act to random kindness. Process calculates line direct signals, C over K, K over C. Set course centers and division lines, ground centers, lines, and signal location, setting, convergence system, opposition location, platitude line, position line, universe line, communication, spectacle lines, spin lines, high centers, directing line, ground, correlates, and line connection, and convergence system, alter travel, position, point, graph, communication lines, high position, measure, and scale, communication lines, convergence system, all through calculations. That's my equation. It's amazing how this is all set in calculations all through graph. So the graph screens, 4 centers of the travel, 6 lines of measure, 45 line angles, and flux over setting. Process indicates in system all through calculations. That's my equation. Very powerful stuff through a space arc. Okay, so we got the correlation lines of panel, we got the solar disk, we got the locking signal lines of 144 precursor, directing lines of position of past, present, future. Now we allocate time lines, center lines, agendas line, communication screen line, adaptation lines, and symbiote going forward line, communication with convergence system, truth narrative, process lines of force line into future adaptation in one cycle, 3 centers of scale, 4 line centers, line position of formation lines, screen line conditions of communication setting and convergence. Applied 2 lines and 3 rotational lines of screen location setting and adapters. Alpha line, beta, theta, operation 1 omega, process lines and 1 line travel communications interference. Directing ground centers, online signal, online pattern, online conditions, snowy graph. In the rainbow screens, adaptations of travels and 4 communication setting graph lines, cross line, angle line, communication time measure, time scale, cross line, position of panel, open window line, rotation, inside travel communications. And we work with the lacing lines of strings. It's a lot of strings. Okay, so inhibitors over one planetary line has a course line of 1, 0, process line indicates lines of 0 gravity, and position lines of truth. Sets lines of false over cross line into all calculated lines into your subtronic line screen adaptations of travel. Magnetic force line into cubing. 4 box frames, 3 centers of communications. Sets calculation screen lines, change information lines, and ground lines of sequence location setting. Okay? Change communication lines of grounds, online sequence, online travels, line conditions, and line centers. 1 inhibitor, 3 centers, and molecule, 3 structure and design line into units. Set course centers, directing ground centers, online sequence lines of planetary alignment. 4 settings of channels, online solar system. Planetary lines into 4 sequence, 4 centers, 4 travels, 3 line communications, convergence system, all the calculations. Travels, positions, point lines of graph. Initiate, run. All through setting. It's all set up. Woo! Are we having fun? All right, let's get into convergence system of channel. Proxy over lines into capillaries. Indicate voice line pattern equals it in line conditions symbiote. Okay. 3 centers of travel, 3 zeros and rotations, 1 alpha lines, 1 beta operation. Set lines of communication on 2 theta line condition triangulation, box over frame, and 2 flux. Okay. Setting sequence on 2 patterns, operation lines of 4 box frames and travel. Is convergence system of the calculations. So we got indicate lines in all line positions into 4-dimensional sail and rotation lines of precursors and travel. See the sails? All right, so we have 2 line divisions going this way and 2 divided line centers going this way in travel communications. Setting convergence system, all through setting. Process lines in line conditions of flowchart, E-charts, line conditions assume resonance, process of indication lines of tubing. Directing centers and rotation lines, connecting all formation line connections. Calculate and modify platforms over E factors, center lines, position lines of E centers, and communication lines of simulation graphs, and rotation line calculation. Launch pads. 1x 2000 line rotation, 3 centers, 4 travels, 4 communication setting convergence. Okay, so then we set the tubing lines, the triangulation over lines, energetic dome screens, online center line conditions of now in sequence location of panel. Sets point lines of graph, in line condition setting and positions, mixture patterns into earth line rotation surface. Correlation set lines of 196. We start off with 1 line measure, line condition 6/9, line 9/6, lines of 6 line communication, high line condition and settings, operation line sequence, and a planetary alignment and rotation of center and communication of flywheel travel. All done by equation. All through chart waves, flow charts, E-charts, line conditions, symbiote. Okay. Amazing how you come in that convergence system all through setting through portal. Portal line communications is convergence, sets online tracks. It gets complicated, doesn't it? But it's a lot of fun. Set position over 2, over 3, over scale, over measure, over line. Directing ground centers, online sequence, platitude, online sequence, spectrum over 4 centers, lines of travel. Directing lines of platforms over set location, high centers, calculation lines of position. Floaters of a mechanism, online center, in position to affinity 8 rotation lines, set lines of travel. Directing ground centers, line sequence, platform, line, position, location, line connection, the 3 convergence system, all through platitude, line, position, of walking, screen line, adaptation lines, of 4 line communication, simulation, graph, calculation lines, and the high center lines of travel. Done by equation. Symbiote and face rectangle on 3-dimensional lines is construct. It's all set up. So I'm showing you exactly how this positions your systems all through travel. all through calculations, all through modification of the grounds. Okay? Face recognition of Symbiote is going to be all lines of 12 platforms, guys. Act line centers is the process lines into position. So it's act upon. Okay. Now then that line centers is the unification lines of travel, direct lines of correlation lines into atmospheres over change. Directing ground centers, the graphing screens, A, B, C, D, E, F. Box frame, triangulation box frame, coordinate pyramid activation frame. All right, so inside lines in circulation of grounds, setting structure lines into position. Location rent line, high centers, line condition, convergence setting, one question over line, one question upside line, and travel communications. Equal line charts, flow charts, equal lines, course centers, triangulation lines of 1 over cross line and separation over 4. Sets position line, ground centers, online sequence, and triangulation communication in its convergence system through settings. Process of indication lines and flow charts and direct lines of highways. Now we go into graphing screens, inside rotations. Documentation of docile, formation lines and application over center, and travel communications and direction. Okay, so it's at E chart to a flow chart, directing ground centers into high skid marks. Process to indicate lines influx over 1, 2, and 3 centers of scale. Inside rotations in high cent line communicates to its dimensional lines of scale and road graph screen location. So we bring that into charterways and line communication. Okay. Okay, so we have a direct line sight now. We have flow line and rotations and positions of 4 probings and set lines detections of surveys and mass. Inside travel communications and directions. All right. Okay, so we change the flow charts, directing on centers into E factors over Q. Now the quantum line interface sets course centers and 3 centers of measure, parent activation lines and screen locations at 45 scale. Routers, and 4 communications and line settings at surface. Okay, so we operate the sun line and platitude lines and protocol system into chain command and 3 centers of travel, directing ground centers online sequence location of 5 lines of measure. Set lines of simulation, Symbiote over factor, simulation over setting, simulation over grounds, simulation over setting, simulation over setting, simulation over center operations, setting over track communications, all in set tractions. All set position. It's all set up. So I'm just showing you through dimensional solar sail how it lines a course, a recourse, and it has a direct line communication lines of 4 scale. Process on the solar sail has a direct line view. Linking chains process lines of 4 centers into 5 lines of sequence. Process lines of 4 line travels and direct lines of calculation or simulation. Ground centers into your galactic hub and travel communications. So it has a solar panel, echo screen, directing ground centers, lines, screen locations. Flow charts, and direct lines and links and communication with convergence. Process indicates lines of flights, of manifolds, and rotational lines and channel screens and center communication. Inside travel. Correlation to Symbiote adds a line course to its algorithm that rotates the line centers into 30,000 lines of black holes, indicates ground centers lines of sequence and flotation device lines and screen locations. Sets communication lines of travels, formation lines and sonar and echo and screen location. Indicate on-line charts, directing lines into initial line, operation lines of sequence, location, and initial lines of points. Sets travels of point lines, triangulation, over 2 centers and rotation. Travel point lines of graph, Symbiote comes in, and face recognitions. All through tractions, all through directions. Done by equation. So there's 12 convergence system of plateaus into preceding lines of units of precursors and cursor locations. Okay, so it's all set up inside rotation. Okay, very powerful stuff, isn't it? Travels its own inside travel. Okay, E-course. Directing lines of solar disk lines of 1 line center, power generation lines of 4 centers, 4 sequence and 4 panels. Equals with equations in the Y screen. 3 travels indicates lines of box frame over screen locations. E factors over line in constellation lines of 1. Process lines and conversion lines. Direct line position of cloud lines into internal to external force. Online setting on sequence. Set course centers in brain conception setting and travel. All right, correlates and calculates lines of tether over attachments into wire signals, location lines of grounds. There's the tree. Process calculates lines of grounds into position. There's the pyramid. Row graph, screen line, high center, line condition setting, convergence system of 45 flux over angles, and position lines of travel. So that's set up in a window frame. Sets lines of 4, set lines of 4, and set lines of 4 in sequence. Triangulation into molecules, assigned lines in one center, rotation. Child points under the graph, symbiotes on top line center. Setting patterns in rotation of seconds, minutes, and hours of frame. Clock and line condition setting. Process line indicates the system. Molecule design line, high position of protons and location neurons. Setting patterns, graphing screens, overline screen locations. 007, process lines, ground center, computer setting, line position, location of travel. General AI, XX1, process lines, XX2, process lines, a conversion system. Molecule design line, protocol line, rotation line, connected to the conversion system, all through travel, all position, balance line, now line, sequence line, position, location, conversion system, all through travel. Line condition setting, online center, online sequence, online communication setting, and constellation system, all through atmosphere line, rotations, and travel communications. Done by equation. Amazing how you simulate the ground centers and surface of travel. Pixelation lines and rotation setting and travel communications. All three directions. Now we work inside the particle streaming. Inside communication. All right, so we add the indicators and line conditions set to transponders to responders. So we set a CR code into E factors over 1 code. Process lines of 1 over 2 over 3 in travel. Okay. Then we indicate the particle acceleration lines. We set a 1 line standard line condition set convergence set location to its symbiote. On centers over cross, directing inside and outside through travels in fortitude locations of highways. Outside in, inside line condition. Graphing screen, timestamp procedure, and rotation lines at ground centers as sequence. Online centers of travel. Now we indicate overline centers, crossing line of angles inside position lines of communications. That's set up in travel. Okay, so we indicate lines, we fortitude rotations and travel into ground centers. Change finger point lines of graph. Now that center line connection to your finger lines is the direct lines of imprints. Now we process the position location, measure its scale, sets an E-flow chart, process line indicates lines. Direct lines into 1.5, into position locations of 2.0, set position of 2.2. Set lines of travel. 3 times the scale, 3 times the measure, 3 box frames, 3 window frames, 3 triangulation line condition settings, converts the system, all through setting into high calculation. All right, so we're setting E course into 2 zeros over lines and process lines of 0 over travel. Calculate and modify into solar screens and solar line direction, setting 1 lines of flux over 5 over measure, 2 over scale, 0 over 1, 0 over calculation, and 2 platforms over Z. That's 2 wind sails and rotation. Now the travel point lines graph is a 1 line measure, 5 lines of scale, cross lines in high position of 2 over lines of 1 position, 2 zeros over travels into solar graph. Directing ground centers, online sequence, and 1 opposite direct centers in a 45 communication setting where the symbiote rotates the system all through tractions. Very complicated stuff, but you get a true understanding. So body line frequencies at 144, symbiote and position 3 down line structure, sets communication time frames, seconds, minutes, and hours into a 24 line setting in sequence. Sets communication and ground lines is setting. Online convergence system all through travel. Okay? All right, so we go through the timeline. Timeline centers time out. Process lines and position lines and solar generations. Screen lines of 3 zeros. Platitude of 2 4 centers into 1 sequence. Measure lines, triangulation over lines, paradigmatization of 4 centers, lines of travel. Now that indicates echo, sonar, Zulu. Okay? Platitude over lines, centers, and position location, the routers and location. Online center, platitude 1 over line signals, routes, lines, travels, and direction. Set communications and settings all through sequence and screen adaptations of flux. Okay, overcross lines and 3 centers of travel, 4 centers of scale, and set position location grid. Online sequence, online pattern, and center communication setting in flux over screen. All right, so we set position of symbiote over tractions, seconds, minutes, and hours in frame. This time it's hours, minutes, and frame. Process lines at 24 line centers. Configuration of ground lines, line condition general AI, lines at 007. Applied division locate lines, start line communications out, action lines out, emotion lines out, signal lines at grounds, online sequence and platform, in position lines at EQ, factor over screen. Directing ground centers online sequence, platitude location setting over cross location setting as ceiling. Set course centers lines of travel, outline setting, cross in, out in rotation. Platitude 1, 2, and 3 centers and 4 lines of scale. Process indication over crowd lines, crowding fun line, high center lines of travel, direct lines engaging viewers, avatars and triangulation over box frame, triangulate position operation line sequence, platforms in that rotation, into your investors and rotation lines, individual system, all through circuits and travel communications. Symbiote over 1, symbiote over 2, and symbiote over 3. Precursor and cursor in position and online centers, 144 line centers and channels, and triangulation lines of 1 set line cycle. High centers lines of communications into door recognition of time frame and set travel communications. All done my equation. So I'm just showing you how this is all set up and measure and scale in that communication. Okay? And that's it. That's it. We arrive and departure and position at 6 a.m. Rendezvous and set travel. All right. See you in 5.